Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this British Cartographic Society Tea Time talk. I'm David Sherron. I'm the Secretary of the BCS, and I'll be chairing this session this evening. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Tristam Willis, who is Academic Head of Secondary and Prepa at the Victoria School, is that right? Which I believe is located in Tequisquiapan in central Mexico. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I hope that's sufficiently far away from... Okay, oh, thank you, right, yeah. I'm hoping that's far enough away from Hurricane Eric, which I think made landfall earlier today, and that you're not blowing away. Anyway, the title of Tristam's talk is The Perspective of a Geography Teacher, How I Use Maps as Tools for Learning, Application and Creation within Geographical Topics and Concepts. So over to you, Tristam.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. I have to be honest, I'm getting flashbacks already to my Zoom lessons during COVID lockdown, but hopefully we'll be able to smoothly enjoy and make the most of this. And I hope that at least one person from here can find something of value that they can use. Good evening, everybody. I am Tristam Willis, and welcome to my presentation, The Perspective of a Geography Teacher, How I Use Maps as Tools for Learning, Application and Creation within Geographical Topics and Concepts. Just a little bit about myself. I originally did my degree in geology. I've moved into education and done a bit of GIS. I'm a secondary trained geography teacher, but I've had experience teaching the subject from pupils in Year 5 primary all the way up to A level. Prior to my current role, I was a geography teacher at Langley Prep School in Tavern, Norfolk. And in addition to that, I'm an examiner for Cambridge, IGCSE and AS level geography and A level. And I examined the IGCSE environmental management paper, and I am a self-confessed map geek, to the point that when I was a child, my parenting strategy would be, I'll just put them in front of the Times World Atlas. That'll keep them occupied for a bit. Okay, so let's get started. Now, first thing we have to do in geography, that's something I value myself, is understanding what core skills a geographer needs. And we can split them up into sort of 5 core areas: problem solving, knowledge of place and space, understanding of human and physical patterns, processes, relationships, interactions, fieldwork skills, and cartographic skills. These particular descriptors here was something I used at my previous school as a core guide onto what my pupils should be achieving. All of them, in one way or another, can be related to maps, not just fieldwork skills, not just cartographic skills. And this is essential because ultimately a large aspect of geography is about place and what is happening there and how it affects elsewhere. So all of these can be linked in one way or another to these core skills. Now, from a pedagogical perspective, I also need to consider a thing called Bloom's taxonomy. So me as a teacher, I need to try and make sure I get a balance to the point that if the pupils are achieving their highest skills and understanding, they're at that higher end of the create and evaluate edge of the Bloom's taxonomy. So we're first trying to sort of, how can I put this, make sure they can just recall the facts, the early stages, and then they can understand it and develop it further bit by bit. So ultimately, by the end, they have such a sound understanding, they could create or work with the scenario themselves that involves the concepts we're covering. Now, what I try and do is also demonstrate that through the use of maps. So where do we start at? Every kid needs a starting point, and ultimately, if they don't know where places are or what they're doing, it's harder to go into that sort of more detailed, more comprehensive understanding. So we've just got to first teach them how to read a map, to understand what is this map telling us and know where places are. So the basic starting point is that idea of grid references, being able to understand the difference between a 4 and 6 figure grid reference, what keys tell us and how those skills can transfer over to other types of maps as well. Reading topography. So is it hilly? Is it flat? What is the impact of that? And your core global location. I'm not going to expect any pupil to necessarily recall every single world capital, but having a general idea of where places are in the world, be it continents, major countries, or mountain ranges, or major rivers. Because If you have that as your foundation, it creates a huge range and opportunity to develop into a variety of different concepts. So with any pupil that can remember where places are and then can understand the significance of those places, okay, we can then develop and go into much more deeper concepts. So ways I can do this, for example, is using Ordnance Survey maps. Those of you who are aware of Bing, they actually have an aspect where if you zoom into anywhere in the UK, you can get an Ordnance Survey map of an area. So that's a really at your fingertips skill. If you're unable to get copies of Ordnance Survey maps, even though they're quite easily to get hold of hard maps, you still have it digital. And then within the realm of teaching, there are a variety of teacher resource websites, for example, tes.com, Times Educational Supplements, where you can download and obtain resources. So the map on the right, whilst it might not necessarily be the most beautiful of maps, it does start you off with that idea of understanding grid references and the use of a key. You know, with a pupil who's 10, 11 years old, you want to start off with something like that, because for them to get their head around some things, it takes a bit extra effort. So we're trying to sort of build it up slowly but surely. Now, by having these sorts of things, you are building that foundation of being able to read a map. Then global location, there's multiple resources to get maps, print out, blank maps on the internet to get kids to also research where places are. You don't just want to say, this is the place. You want them to go and find out where that place is. That part of the process also enables for whatever they're looking for to stick in their memory to a far greater degree. Then once you've got this sort of foundation set up, you can move into the more detailed things, the more meaty concepts that go beyond just looking at a map. In geography is a subject that here in England covers a wide variety of concepts and content, be it geological, when we're looking at plate tectonics, or meteorological weather, or even urban design and planning, so when looking at land use. So you can use maps to cover a whole range of these things, and then you've got to make sure you're using the correct type of map to ensure that what information concept you're doing is accessible and can benefit the pupils. So this is where, if you look at our Bloom's taxonomy, we're at the apply and analyze stage, you know, understanding what's going on and how it can be used. In the case of Ordnance Survey, you can actually use that to understand what is the land being used for when you use the key, or you look at the size of the buildings. Satellite maps is actually also a very good tool for demonstrating sort of climatic conditions between places. I will demonstrate an example of that coming up in a second. And then you've got your choropleth maps as well, which is a good way of enhancing and showing data. Now, much of this isn't at, I'd say, university level, but it is done at a stage that is accessible for pupils and can be that springboard for them to take things further. And even having a blank map for a pupil to convey their own understanding of what they're looking at. So a simple example that I've done in the past is for pupils to identify on a map where the highlands are of the UK, and then using that to identify where the driest parts of the UK are, where the wettest parts of the UK are, where the coldest, where the warmest parts of the UK, and see how any of those different things interact. So if coldest and warmest is demonstrated, for example, by latitude, being north or south, how far they are between them, or with precipitation, what side of the mountains they're on. So to continue this, I'm now going to show a couple of examples that I've used in my lessons. So the first map here on the right is a satellite image of Chile, the Andes, and I've circled two parts. At the top, I've circled a dry area, a desert. Now, what I would use first, I wouldn't necessarily say that's dry. I'd ask the pupils, what do they see? Why do they think it's like that? And the same can be said for the circle in the south, which is much greener. Now, the purpose of this map is ensuring, well, before I even start, is to ensure that the pupils understand the location of the Andes mountain range now. So that allows me to use the purpose of this map to demonstrate the importance of rain shadow and wind direction. Now, I can also use maps for trying to get pupils to understand patterns and similarities between two different maps. As you can see, you're probably all familiar with your plate tectonic maps and where your location of earthquakes and volcanoes are. Now, if I was to ask a pupil straight away, do you see any links between these maps, understanding those spatial relationships? Some might say yes, and they'd be able to describe it by looking at it. Others might need a little sort of nudge in the right direction. And that's when you can do something like this. By demonstrating this overlay, how different maps interact with each other, pupils can see that from here, there is definitely a link between plate boundaries and where earthquakes and volcanoes happen. So it's a nice way of establishing relationships between different features. In addition, you also can use maps as a tool where kids can actually get stuck in, following instructions and understand what the purpose of the map is. Now, this is a task I created for pupils in Year 7. So whilst I'm not expecting the most perfectly drawn map and accurate, the purpose of this is for pupils to understand the significance of where hazards can be found and their impacts by shading in areas. So they're creating their own maps. This is now we're at the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy, where they can sort of get hands-on and understand what's going on. From this perspective, pupils should then get an idea of what different hazards there are, how it might affect. Now, I'm not asking for a perfect map, but as I say, the key is to ensure that the concept that these pupils learn is found there. And so then in the future, they can apply that in a different scenario. Another really important aspect with maps also I find is the ability to be hands-on and to take things further. So forgive the crudeness of my maps drawing. I'm not a cartographer. This was something drawn using PowerPoint. But the purpose of this is for pupils to look at the map and understand some key features in the application of flooding. If you look on the map on the left, pupils will need to create their own flood risk map. Now, if they're applying the concepts that you've covered, you'd hope to think that on the right, where you have the more impermeable rock, you're more likely to get faster flow of water into the river, whilst on the left, you've got the forest area, which might reduce the speed of flow into the river. This then allows you to identify which river is more likely to have flooding and where it might be most affected. I know these maps might not be perfect, but the key thing again is the concept and the ability to read the map and read the information that's there, so they have a key. So I can then assess a pupil's conceptual understanding on the left of what causes floods by how well they've identified which areas are more likely to get flooding compared to other areas. If we then look at the map on the right, we can also, it also gives the pupils a chance about how to apply their knowledge for solutions. Now, this is where the creativity comes in. They can decide what solutions they might feel necessary. If they're having to put in a flood barrier, have areas that are specifically for planned flooding and floodplains, straightening rivers or creating channels on the side or even dams. And it allows the pupils to sort of be hands-on. Now, what I also have with pupils is an opportunity to understand things and see things in different ways. I want to engage them. I want them to find something interesting, something fun. So the map at the bottom is a website called The True Size Of. This is one for helps me to explain to the kids the significance of the Mercator projection. Whilst it's not necessarily something important for a pupil in Year 8 or Year 9 to know, what it does allow you to teach these pupils is how big countries really are. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute when I get to the next couple of slides. The tool on the right is from a website called mapinseconds.com. Now, this is a tool which I often use for the kids if they want to create a choropleth map of collecting data. So when we're covering the subject, for example, of globalization, I give the kids a task where they have to go around the house and find out the location and country of where different things have been made. They can then input the data into this website to create themselves a map to demonstrate which countries have more one thing than others. So it can then be used as a tool for pupils to collect data and demonstrate data. The next map here I use is often a tool which I find really valuable, especially when teaching concepts of meteorology and climate. This is a website which does have a live feed, which I'm now going to share with you. So here we go. So I hope you can all see this map now on the screen. And this map here demonstrates a live feed of what the current climatic conditions are. So at the moment, I've decided to have it selected on currents and temperature. Now, when teaching climate, this map can allow me two things to show: the impact of the warm currents coming up from the Gulf of Mexico that might affect the UK, because you can see the flow, but also this allows me the chance to demonstrate pupils how hurricanes form. So in the case of hurricanes forming or hurricanes we see in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, we can clearly see from this map that actually they start their formation off the west coast of Africa, which not many people might necessarily know. So having these live feeds is a great thing to show how weather and climate is a constantly moving thing. This is the website that I demonstrated earlier. So if I want to demonstrate the sheer scale of a country, and this is actually one that younger kids absolutely love because they want to see how big a place is. And it's more a tool to hook them in. You want to get that hook, that enjoyment. So if they want to know how big England really is compared to another country, you can just drag it down and it changes its size. So if you move up, that's how it would appear on a Mercator map, Mexico. But if you actually just leave it at the latitude of current years, it's a great tool to interest the pupils and get them engaged, especially the younger ones. We then have also this website Map in Seconds, which I was talking about. So you can essentially just input different data for countries, all right, and then it can convert it into a choropleth map for you. So again, when pupils are starting to do investigations of places and collecting data on places, this is a great, easy introductory tool that pupils can use. And I've also included up here Bing Maps as well. And let me have a look. And other sort of educational tools. So let me just get this up here. So Bing Maps, as you can see, is something that any teacher across the UK, when they have to teach Ordnance Survey, can access. On top of that, the Ordnance Survey website do have plenty of resources for schools. Now, I'm just going to go back to my presentation. Let's have this here. Moving on, we've got to understand maps isn't just something you should use in a geography lesson. Okay, it is something that can be used across the board and also is accessible for kids. Now, I first want to talk about that map on the right you see. It brings up my point about the accessible for the less academic pupils. Back in either 2021 or 2022, this map was entered into the British Cartographic Society for, I think it was 2021, for the Restless Earth Workshop, something that that Langley School have been doing for quite a few years. This was aimed in particular at Year 6 pupils, even though the Restless Earth Workshop was originally planned for GCSE pupils. So immediately at that front, we recognize that you can create maps to be accessible for younger people, but also on a less academic perspective. Of the group of kids that did this, 2 were very strong academically. The other 2 weren't necessarily the strongest on the academic front, but they had the ability to understand what's happening. And one of them happened to be an incredibly good artist. This allowed the pupils to show how they can still be good at geography, but in a different way. So it enables and allows other skills to flourish. Some kids do have a far greater ability to explain things verbally or pictorially than they do with words. So it also acts as a form of differentiation in the classroom. So while some kids can understand the concept through text, others need to see it visually. But we mustn't just keep it in the geography classroom. You know, examples where maps can be used in art, history, maths, English, science. So for example, in history, you can see what I posted there. So a map of Europe in 1871, for example, to get pupils to understand how countries are constantly changing concept and identity. You've got maths is also a tool where you can use if you're collecting data to present stuff and put into a map. English, a story, an adventure. You can demonstrate that through that. And science, if you're collecting spatial data, if you're wanting to do an investigation, for example, in a field of the occurrence of a particular plant, and you want to map that out, where do you find the majority of those there? So this is where maps can be used across the board and can make education accessible for the pupils. We mustn't forget also that there's so many topical things that you can find in maps. I've included 2 books that I've recently, well, one I read a few years ago and one that I've recently read. I'm sure quite a few of you that might be watching this have definitely heard of Prisoners of Geography and probably have read this as well. But both of these give ideas of concepts, topics, be it politics, climate change, sort of health. All of it can come and be used as a tool to demonstrate really important topical issues. But maps also, to take this further, topical issues, you've got another website that I've used in the past called gapminder.com. Now, this was set up by the late Hans Rosling, who was a statistician, a doctor as well. And within this, you've got multiple different statistics which you can plot onto a map. You can see how different countries compare to each other. So this, for example, could just be population, but you could also use it on life expectancy, GDP per capita, to understand where parts of the world differ from each other. And that is a really important thing to understand. Things like interrelationships between countries, levels of development as well, for example. When going further, and also, we also got to think about projects. One key thing within geography teaching is that idea to demonstrate, a project, an investigation. I have in the past with my pupils used QGIS to create an opportunity for the pupils to do a land use survey of an area. What I do is create a blank template and allow the kids to go out and collect the data, and they come in, and then I've set it up that all of them through QGIS can try and create their own land use map and style it how they like. But there are also other tools and websites you can use. I've mentioned Esri Schools, that has a whole range of resources. Obviously, Ordnance Survey, and also Digimap for Schools is another website. So again, this gives a great opportunity for pupils in the classroom to experience maps in different formats with different bits of information and understanding those interrelationships between space. One of the realities also as a teacher in school is examinations. And in the case of GCSE geography or even IGCSE geography, there is always a section on map skills, reading maps, being able to give good references, understanding topography, landscape by interpreting the maps. And within that, you have specific thematic maps. On top of that, part of the coursework, as mentioned earlier, providing maps with data is often a very good way to demonstrate higher level understanding than just a bar chart. Now, what we also consider is the future. We are in a very rapidly changing world. Technology is moving incredibly fast. The advent of AI, for example, in the most past couple of years, the use of GIS is a growing industry. Use of mobile devices, technology, how can we maximize that to benefit us in the classroom? Is assessment going to change? Will it be based around more map skills or sort of less sort of spatial concepts? And also the idea of moving from printed maps to digital maps. And finally, life skills. What are the life skills? I'll give the example here of how geography teaching can affect somebody's ability to read a map. So, for example, my wife, she's Mexican, she had Mexican education. Geography isn't considered the same broad range subject with skills that it is in the UK. So when she's got her sat-nav map on, she cannot have it from the bird's eye view. She needs to understand it with the car facing the direction you're going. Whilst I've had that training and understanding of reading maps from above, which has allowed me to not worry about using that sort of style of map. So again, all of these things are really, really important. How can they benefit us? So there's lots still to consider. And in this rapidly changing world, we have to be able to adapt. And maps will become part of that, especially with the use of GIS and data. And so it's important that pupils develop those skills or get introductions to those skills so they can be in the best possible position later on. And this brings us to the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristan. That was excellent. Really, really interesting. I mean, I've attended all of the tea time talks, I think, over the years, and I think it doesn't matter how much I think I know about maps. I'll always pick up something from these that I didn't know before. So I know tomorrow I'll be going to have a look at a map in seconds, which I hadn't heard of before, or Gapminder, I think it was. So yeah, so you've given me something to have a look at. Yeah, do post your questions in the chat, please. That would be excellent. Certainly, your talk certainly made me think about my geography education way back in the 1970s, or it was for my O level. It's great to see that maps play such an important part in your teaching today. I mean, maps are quite important, I suppose. Then, when I was doing my O level in the 1970s, it was. I have to confess, yeah, because we do this exercise where you were required to memorize a particular map of a place. It might be the Corn Belt in the United States or something like that, and then the following week you'd be tested on that, and you'd have to draw it out. And I have to confess, it's the only time in my life I've ever cheated, because I discovered that on my exercise book, if I practiced the map on my exercise book on a sheet of paper, it left an impression on the page underneath. When I used that the following week, I could sort of trace around that. But I'm not proud of it. This hasn't been recorded, is it? No, I'm not proud of that. I was also impressed that you managed to draw some maps using PowerPoint. That was,
yeah, just basic little shapes. That was I thought if I wanted to go into QGIS, it'd take too long to get that perfect little map. So I thought I needed to get something simple, clear, and understandable for 12, 13-year-olds to be able to interpret. And that is the key bit, making sure what I produce is accessible, because you can fall into the trap of just getting so stuck into your map that you're adding all this extra detail that might not need to be necessary, which then confuses the kids further and talks about things that's irrelevant to the concept you want to address.
So we've got a few questions coming in now, which is great. Bob is asking, can you talk about core knowledge of geography in Mexico and UK?
Yeah, well, geography teaching in the UK compared to Mexico and the interpretation of what is geography in schools is very important. In the UK, geography covers a huge range of themes, be it physical geography, human geography. So within that, you've got geological processes, plate tectonics, meteorology on the physical side, for example. On the human side, it could be migration, population studies, urban life, urban structures. So they covers a vast array. In Mexico, geography isn't considered that, because all those subjects that I just talked about in the UK understanding of geography are their own subject in their own right in Mexico. So geography at school level is purely location, more or less, knowing where places are, knowing what's what, knowing where the different states of Mexico are, the main rivers of the world. So it doesn't have that same range of themes. So if you would then go to look at Mexican universities and what subjects and topics they offer, very few actually offer geography as a subject, but you'll find plenty that might offer urban design, plenty that offer meteorology, plenty that might offer environmental science, plenty that might offer social studies and agro-aquarian projects and all those things. So on that perspective, the understanding of what geography is very different between the two countries. So what we have at my school, we have a little bit of geography, which I'm making sure I'm keeping alive. But actually, after year 9, any people that wants to go into sort of an environmental subject, we offer an IGCSE in environmental management. So it's slightly different. So what I try and make sure is those core skills that the pupils that I would be teaching anywhere, geography, I can convey over into a different subject and still ensure that idea of the use of maps. So, for example, in environmental management, when we have to talk about fish stocks and the ocean as a resource, I put two maps together. One map shows where the major fishing grounds are, another map shows where the population densities of the world are. And then you see some pupils start to cotton on, hang on, these major fishing grounds are very close to the high population densities. Why is that? And then you can get the ball rolling and things. So even if it's not geography, it's something that can transfer across many other subjects.
Okay, brilliant. Another one here from John. He's also been saving all those links that you gave out earlier, and he asks, of the array of tools, which do you use the most in your role?
This sounds not particularly techy, but to draw some of those basic maps, so that hazard map of the volcano, the flooding map, creating shapes in PowerPoint is very simple. I might get the initial map, put that as an overlay and try and trace over it. So it's not really that technically challenging. There are times though where I have used QGIS to create a map. So again, going back to some stuff I've done at Ocean as a resource, as a way of getting pupils to read a map to identify where's a good location for tidal power and what sort of tidal power. I would use QGIS, OpenStreetMap, get some data from that and create it. They're all very simple. I don't overcomplicate it, and not too much. So in the case of I happen to just use a part of the east coast of Canada because it's got these nice bays and shapes, which makes it easy to create a scenario where these pupils could sort of apply their understanding of where the tidal ranges are, where the winds are coming from. So you're making sure the map's labeled. So I sort of, for creation resource, I would use those. But I am constantly trying to see what other interesting things there are, because it's one thing creating the resource, but sometimes there's particular thing you do is also got to get that hook. What's going to sort of grab their attention, and this is where, for example, that website of Null School Earth I used to demonstrate the current climatic conditions in a live feed, and the reality is also satellite imagery. Satellite imagery is amazing. One website I haven't linked is also Google Earth Engine. Now, on that, you can actually get time-lapse maps. So if you want to show how a meander changes over time, you can zoom into a part of the Amazon on the river, and it'll give you the first picture of 1984, and every year it'll give you the next satellite image moving along until 2018, and you can see how that meander has changed. But it's also a good way of also demonstrating urban growth, how a town has grown and how a city has grown over time. Or if you want to address issues of climate change, how a glacier has shrunk, or issues on deforestation as well. So, and you showing that time lapse and time change also highlights the implications of what's happening. We have a lot of pupils in every school around the world that live in the bubble of their hometown, their area, and are not aware of what's happening. So if you can show these things, it allows more people to be aware of these issues and they see it moving and changing. It gives them a far greater sense of reality, because a lot of these things, if we just looked at it live, we wouldn't really see anything changing, but making sure it's all speeded up, they can actually see these impacts. It also, going back to some of the more basic resources, sort of global location tasks, locating where sort of cities and countries are incredibly important, because I think some of the biggest issues affecting us today, we have so many people who don't know where this place is or that place is. They think, well, I don't know where it is. Why should it matter to me? But the more people are aware of where these different countries are and how these countries relate to other countries and their links, people were thinking, okay, actually, this might affect me. What is the implications of this? And then it's easier for people to then think critically about a scenario that's affecting your country. We could get into a long story in that one, but it's important to, as a basic idea, if people are understanding of location and place, it helps them to put concepts also into context.
Great. I absolutely agree with you about keeping things simple. I mean, I use PowerPoint a lot. I use it for poster design, and I think it's absolutely brilliant for that. Now, I'll come back to a question from Chris in a moment, but Jim's asked a sort of related question. You've talked about the tools you've used most, and he's asking which tool do you find to be the most versatile?
That's again very similar. It depends what I want to do. If I want to create something or show something, to create something, you know, I use QGIS because it's free and I understand it, so it's easy for me to create the map resources. And same PowerPoint if I just want to create a particular image or get two maps to overlap so people can see those contrasts as I demonstrated with plate tectonics. So versatility is important, but the other issue with the tools, and I'll relate this to GIS tools, for someone who understands GIS using Esri or QGIS, it's easy, it's clear. But if you want to get kids to be able to do geographical investigations, if they can use QGIS or Esri or any other sort of GIS software, great. But it's actually so much information to a 15-year-old, 14-year-old kid of what does what and different things. You have to really almost use it pre-set up on certain things. So you've created that sort of template map for them to work on, not for them to create it, because otherwise it gives them far too much and can confuse and complicate things. So there's a lot of preparation that has to go into any resource you create. And as I say, versatility is a very important word, because you've also got to understand, I just want to make sure this concept is understood. So whilst I could get glued to this and just playing about with cues, going, oh, look at that, let's change this style, let's do that, I can then miss the point. And so I've always got to bring myself back in. And so this is where actually creating and drawing something simple on PowerPoint is quite good. And a really important tool is a scenario building situation. So we did a module on economic development, how places differ. And then I created this fictional island. I just drew a map on PowerPoint and made sure I lined up certain features. I created templates of this map which had rainfall, templates of this map which had temperature. So they had to develop this country in the different economies. So where would they improve farming, or what sort of farming would they do based on the climatic data? They'd have to think about road networks and rail networks and how that influences where you locate your factories on this island, businesses. And it's open-ended. And that open-ended allows for creativity. And the core thing you then get to do is ask them why they chose that. And if they can then justify their choices and they can explain it well, that tells you how well they've understood that concept of whatever it might be with economic development. So the impact of location of a factory, or the need to be near population, or road networks. And with that, you then can know they've understood it. Because even when you're choosing to locate something on a map, it's not like closing your eyes and throwing a dart and see where it lands. You've actually got to give it careful consideration. Now, that's a very simplified version of modern day civil engineering and big development projects of how do you locate things? What are the impacts of them? Making sure the connections are there, the road networks, and all of those things.
Right. Now, Chris has asked, have you tried using orienteering as a method for enhancing map awareness?
Yes. What I often do when, this is actually with also maths teaching, understanding bearings and direction. So again, I was lucky enough at my old school that we had these beautiful grounds. We had a woodland area, we had big fields, it was countryside Norfolk. And that allowed a great opportunity for kids to apply their understanding of direction. I don't want kids to go, we're going to move to the left of the map. I want them to say, we're going to move west as a basic rule. So also that orienteering and bearings and language is very important. And so this is the idea, we can bring in so many different sort of adventures almost by using orienteering and getting that idea. And then from place to place, you can have little challenges that happen with that. So it's not just getting them to go from A to B to C. It's once they got to B, what do they have to do? They've got a challenge to get them engaged. And also I use it to create, you can use it to create competition and races. Sometimes with some kids, they respond far better when there's a competition at stake. And all of a sudden, like, right, we're going to win this. When they're in the classroom, they're going just floating along. And so every now and again, mixing it up and doing those things can really help.
Okay. Now, Bob's asking, have you got any comments you can make about use of maps in Mexico, as I assume Ordnance Survey is not available to the same extent?
The Bing map I showed you, I
Yeah.
don't have a VPN on my laptop, so I can still access UK Ordnance Survey maps, and so as an immediate resource. So the core skill of understanding and applying grid references is a core skill that you can apply to any map in the world. Doesn't matter where you are. As a resource, the Ordnance Survey maps are there and available. And one thing to consider also, for example, if you, as an international school, if you're doing IGCSE geography, there's their exam paper on skills has a whole section on map skills. Now, they might have an Ordnance Survey map, or they might have the equivalent of another country, be it Norway or France or somewhere else. But those core skills of reading those grid references are there. Within Mexico as well, there are different government organizations that also are able to provide geographical data of the country, which you can then use to convey what particular issues. So if you want to do it like levels of economic development between states and Mexico, there's accessible data which you, in theory, could decide and plot into your own Choropleth map, for example, using Map in Seconds, and create your own Choropleth map of Mexican levels of GDP per capita, but based on state. So within Mexico, it's a lot of the skills are cross-country. It doesn't matter if that's a skill you learn in one place, you can apply it here as well. And as long as you make sure there's that consistency of how maps are produced and developed, it's very important.
And is there paper mapping of Mexico that you use? I'm afraid I know nothing about the mapping of Mexico, I have to admit, despite being a map librarian.
Not you used to have your A to Z road maps, but in this day and age where you can use your smartphone as a sat nav, it's a lot harder to get hold of. There are some about, but the reality is that paper is becoming less common. You can buy kids' atlases and bookshops. You can use that as a resource as well, which I actually like to use, because when you find a pupil in year 9 doesn't know what an index is, you think, okay, we've got to work on something here. So it allows them to develop their core research skills before they're spending their time tapping away on a keyboard. So that is very, very important. So Mexico as a country, because how it understands geography differently, those resources that we would have quite freely and quite openly in the UK, you've got to do a bit more digging to find them, or using secondary data to create your own version.
Now, Rachel says that geography was her favourite subject, of course. Yeah, here, agree with that, Rachel. Keep up the good work, inspiring future geographers. Hurrah. Now, Jim wants to know, do you have a favourite map?
Yeah, I've actually got it behind me up here. This was a charity shop find. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. So, of a copy of an engraving, I found it for £15 in a charity shop in Norwich. And I thought I couldn't pass that and not buy it. And so it's something I have in private place in the house. And I've got a couple of others as well scattered about, but this is one that sort of grabbed my attention, considering it's a copy, it's not an original, but the quality of it was quite impressive, and just a very fortuitous, serendipitous almost find.
Brilliant. And I see Susie has also been bookmarking those links that you've shown us. She says, I often teach in an after-school program and would like to come up with a cartography curriculum. So many great ideas you've shown. Yeah, absolutely. Another one from Jim. Have you used National Library of Scotland online maps. I agree. Yeah, it's a great resource for looking at historical maps. I use it a lot. Do you use that at all?
That that is actually the Digimap for schools have access to that. So it's quite a handy one. I used that once a couple of times in the UK for how some places have changed over time. So that was something I used to have access to in the UK. So so indirectly, not to the National Library of Scotland, but through Digimap for Schools, that
Mhm.
access that, which is based in Edinburgh, I believe. Digimap for Schools.
Digimap is based in Edinburgh. Yeah, yeah. But I recommend the National Library of Scotland's mapping resource to anyone. Chris Fleet there has done an absolutely fabulous job of making historic maps available online. It's really first class stuff. Um, Now, Bob's saying your mention of geography and understanding of world events seems to be at variance with the perceived importance of geography in the curriculum. Do you know if that also applies in the USA, where the perception is that they know little about what's going on, for example, in Europe, or dare I say it, the Middle East?
I cannot comment on US education because my knowledge of that is limited, and I don't think would be of significance or value. From a Mexico perspective, what I do find is people's understanding of place, location, and identity is very different. It's a very homogenous society in Mexico, unlike Europe, where you have often countries so interlinked and mixed that there are people that forget that there are other parts of the world in Mexico. And so understanding those sort of global dynamics is very important. And when you also look from an idea of the number of neighboring countries and how countries are closely linked, in Mexico, you've essentially just got one massive country north and then an even bigger one further north than that. And then below Mexico, you've got a couple of little ones. Whilst if you're in Europe, you've got such a different range of countries and different directions you're going that immediate starting point of different that there are different places in the world from an educational perspective and your own personal surroundings already has an impact on your understanding of where places are. Now, if we like historically we're looking, the US had a really big isolationist policy until the world wars, 1941, for example. So that's you'd want to think that more people who have that great understanding of different place can understand their own position in the world and how they link to others. Um, I would always be of the opinion, even if what I'm talking in the curriculum is important, if there's something I can bring in that I think is of important value to people understand to better idea and so for example geopolitics, why is something happening there? I never have a problem in the classroom if I want to go off on a 10-minute tangent on something that I think will widen the horizons of these pupils as well.
Okay, well, that appears to be all the questions in the chat. This is your last chance to pop a question in there, if you wish to, before we wind up. But if there are no more questions, yeah, I'll just say thanks ever so much to you, Tristan, for your time today and for your valuable insights into teaching geography in Mexico. It's really interesting, and it's given well, a lot of comments about the links you provided, and there's lots for us to think about and go back to and explore. So thank you really very much for that, and thank you all of our select viewers who have joined us this evening. For this tea time talk, I'm quite confident there'll be hundreds watching this in the recording later on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank
It's been a
you.
pleasure.
Brilliant. So, yeah, so that's it for our June tea time talk.